Hello, Indivisibles. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Raquel Jackson Stone. You've heard my voice a lot, and I am so excited to be joined by my colleagues today, Carly Cass and Nora Sharp. We are really excited to bring you a brand new workshop today that is focused on building inclusive groups. Before we get started, I want to take some time to acknowledge the moment that we're in right now. We're witnessing protests from small towns to major cities across the nation in honor of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, Tony McDade, Dominique Remy Falls, Raya Milton, Ahmaud Arbery, and honestly, so many others. We're seeing action being taken against the continuous killing of Black people by police and white supremacist violence. And many Indivisibles have stepped up to support these efforts, and we thank those of you who have been following the lead of Black organizations and advancing their needs, their policy suggestions, and supporting their community in invisible ways. Today's training brings those actions home a bit by really looking at our Indivisible groups and exploring how we can deepen our work against racial injustice by building inclusive practices into every single step of our organizing. Now, many who signed up for this training may have noted in the description that we've created it specifically with white Indivisibles in mind. Although all Indivisibles and other attendees are super welcome, and we really hope you find value in what we're offering today. And to our Black and non-Black POC attendees on this call today, we welcome your presence here and any feedback, for real, any feedback you may have or be willing to share. But also, if you feel you'd like to spend your time elsewhere, we welcome that decision too. This workshop should run about an hour, and like I said before, we are saving time after the conclusion of this webinar to do questions and answers. Now, it is not comprehensive by any means, and we know there is so much more to learn. I really just want to thank those of you who are joining us in this moment today. We're really happy you're in community with us, and to be clear, we're all still learning too. This is a huge lifelong process. And so, with that, I want to talk about some housekeeping for today. First, we are recording this webinar, and you will receive a slide deck and recording after tonight's training. If, as I've mentioned before, we have staff monitoring the chat box. And so if you have a question, please type the word question in all caps in the chat box. Our staff will respond to some questions in real time, but we will collect most of the questions and stick around after the training ends for a short optional question and answer. Not all questions will be answered, unfortunately, just because of time, but please know that we do see them, and we will try to follow up with folks post-workshop and know that we're listening. And we also want to put out a warning, just because this is some pretty intense content that we're going into. We really want to make sure this remains a space where people can grow together. So if we see any inappropriate comments in the box, you may be removed from this training. Just fair warning, we're not trying to be mean, but it's really important to keep our attention focused on what we're doing today. And a lot of this is really hard, so distracting chat box can be distracting and harmful. So just a fair warning for all of us to really lean into what we're doing today. So with that, let's review our agenda. We are going to talk about some norms for the space and some community agreements for today's workshop. We're going to talk about inclusion in the context of recruitment, and we're going to provide some context and history for how we got into this moment of time. We'll talk about our next action steps in the core ask, and finally, we'll close with some resources to help you continue this learning. And like I've mentioned a few times, we will have an optional question and answer directly following the conclusion of this webinar. So please join if you can. All right, so let's jump into some community agreements. These will be especially important throughout today's workshop. We know firsthand, I know firsthand, how easy it is to just get frustrated and hang up the call, or just be all up in our feels and just type something out of frustration without really even taking a second to pause and try to understand why we're feeling this way. So with that in mind, we invite you, almost implore you, to join us in these community agreements. The first one is sit with discomfort. Tonight, you may hear some concepts that you might not agree with or need further clarification on. There may be uncomfortable moments as well. We ask you to sit with this discomfort and stay with us, stick with us as we move through these moments. And before dismissing an idea that doesn't quite sit right with you, we really invite you to take a pause and ask yourself why. Why does this frustrate me so much? There will be many moments to pause and reflect throughout the content, and we really encourage you to have some sort of piece of paper or maybe a document open so you can write down your thoughts and feelings as they arise and then come back into the moment. Our second one is acknowledge the journey. Some of us have been doing this work for years and joining tonight in solidarity. Some of us are new, but really excited to learn. It's important for all of us to acknowledge that we're all in this journey together. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it's even scary, but we're all in this together. So just keep that in mind. And our last one is to limit distractions. We're going to ask that folks limit their distractions as much as possible during this workshop because this content is pretty dense. If you're able, we encourage you to go to a quiet place or put your phone on silence. Make sure that you stay on mute. And we ask that folks joining us focus on the presentation and not multitask if that's available to you. We definitely know everyone's inside and kids and other responsibilities, but as much as possible, please limit distractions. And so now, before I go on, I'd like to take a participation pause and ask folks to give a thumbs up or raise your hand, some sort of reaction at the scroll bar at the bottom of Zoom, if you can commit to these agreements. It might help us to remember when was the time that, we had a difficult conversation about race or equity or marginalization. When was the last time you had a challenging learning moment about race? What was valuable about that challenge or that discomfort, even if it was also tricky? Feel free to draw on that moment of discomfort and remember the value that you eventually got from it once you stuck through and got all the way through. We encourage you to remember this and keep this in mind, and encourage others that are staying on with us through their discomfort to remember how valuable this moment can be for us today. So please react in the chat box if you can commit to these agreements. I'm already seeing so much consent. Thank you so much. Even this little gesture of consent really helps us feel like our community agreements are being affirmed in part. And even though we're not all together in person, to make eye contact and use our voices to affirm our commitment to being here. So thank you all so much. Great. So to introduce our first major topic tonight, inclusion as the first step of recruitment. I'd like to ask for some chat box participation once again. Our question is, what brought you to this training today? What aspects of inclusive organizing, recruitment, or anti-racist group practices were on your mind when you signed up? Go ahead and type your answer in the chat box or write it down on your personal reflective notepad. Yeah, see some folks just frustrated, at a loss with not being able to recruit diversity or having a diversity of membership in their groups. And that's really important. You know, we want to make sure we have a ton of different perspectives, especially as we're working to create change. Let's see. It looks like some other folks want their organization to do the work internally, and that's incredible. That's exactly what we're looking for. Want to learn about myself, want to learn how to fight racism. Absolutely. I'm so glad that I'm seeing what definitely aligns with what we wanted to cover next and what we're going to be talking about during this workshop. So let's dig in. At Indivisible, we believe that being part of a movement means including all voices, not just those in our own backyards. And indivisible groups across the country have asked themselves the question, you know, how do we diversify our groups? And some folks in the chat box even asked that question. So I know it's on everyone's mind, especially right now. And the answer lies not in who you recruit, but in what type of group culture you're creating. In our latest recruitment starter pack, the Indivisible staff laid out the process of building inclusive groups as following. First, we have to build a culture of learning whereby everyone in the group with relative privilege believes that ongoing education is necessary and valuable. You have to keep pursuing it. Next, it's important to understand the dominant culture of your group and how white supremacy shows up in your group practices. Along the way, we need to make it everyone's responsibility to honor, acknowledge, and work towards changing group culture to be better. And over time, the big picture requires not only naming race equity work as a strategic imperative for your group, but it's imperative to build relationships with people doing the work outside of your Indivisible group. So over the rest of the summer, we will be offering series of trainings on race, equity, and inclusion that cover various aspects of this process and other core parts of transformational learning. And tonight, we're focusing on the first 3 steps here. Building a culture of learning, understanding how white supremacy shows up in group practices, and making it everyone's responsibility to change group culture for the better. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Nora to get us started with the first piece of this, building a culture of learning. We're going to dig into some of the history that got us to where we are now, both from Indivisible as an organization and for the United States more broadly.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much for that grounding, Raquel. So our investigation of history and context is going to go deep. And as we dig into it, I just want to start right away by calling back to some of those community agreements that we named at the beginning. So we're going to be talking about institutional racism as an abstract concept, but also as a presence in our work at Indivisible. And with that in mind, you know, if there are moments where that's tough to hear or think about, just please know we're with you and we're processing ourselves as facilitators and overall as staff. So stay with us. We'll stay with you. And together, I think we're going to figure out how worthwhile this work can be, not only tonight, but going forward. All right, so let's move into our learning. So it's important to start by just naming the baseline, which is that the United States was founded on and continues to exist because of institutional racism in our daily lives, in our government structures, our law enforcement systems, and more. Our working definition tonight of institutional racism is the systematic distribution of resources, power, and opportunity in our society to the benefit of people who are white and the exclusion of people of color. For credit's sake, this definition we're using tonight comes from the organization's Racial Equity Tools and Solid Ground, and I'm going to continue to reference some of their language just in the next couple of moments here. So present-day racism comes from a long history of racially distributed resources and ideas that shape our views both of ourselves and of others. It's a hierarchical system, and it comes with a broad range of policies and institutions that keep it in place. In the United States, institutional racism has been responsible for slavery, settlement, native reservations, segregation, internment camps, and so much more. And even though a lot of those specific institutions no longer exist in their original forms, they've still had long-term impacts on our society. And we can see those long-term impacts through so many different windows, through generational wealth and current income disparities, through the criminal justice systems that disproportionately incarcerate and harm communities of color, through access to job opportunities or positions of political power, through the healthcare system. I know a lot of us are really aware right now that Black and brown communities have been really profoundly and disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and in many other ways. And the thing is, it can be painful to realize, but these harmful disparities aren't just an accident. They're a direct result of public policy and white supremacist histories, despite many laws that were passed in the mid-20th century and beyond to make discrimination at least theoretically illegal or to otherwise expand civil rights. So Raquel's next going to dig a little bit deeper on some aspects of our history. And just to be really clear, our goal in sharing some of this mini history lesson is to help us understand how our social spaces and the organizing spaces that come out of social space are influenced by those legacies of institutional racism, and to trace how the communities that we find ourselves in today that might be affecting who's showing up in our indivisible groups or otherwise in our communities are not an accident, so that then we can understand how to change them. So Raquel?
Thank you, Nora, and thank you for that grounding around just the society that we live. Like, these things aren't an accident, and it's okay the way that they are, but we have to understand why they are the way they are in order to do something about it. So thank you for naming that. And we have to fast forward through history a little bit just because there's so much, but it's important to talk about how institutional racism shows up today. And for instance, the little mini deep dive we're going to do is on housing and property ownership laws. They are still a mechanism used specifically to control our entire society. And these mechanisms were specifically constructed on racial lines to benefit white society at the expense of Black communities. And this legacy creates the racialized disparities in wealth, education achievement, environmental justice, and even access to fresh food and healthcare that we still feel today, like Nora just referenced with the COVID crisis. So we can take a step back into history and note that white men have always been able to own property and control land from the very beginning of our nation. Black people should have gained the rights and access to citizenship with the 14th Amendment in 1868. But these rights and freedoms were systematically removed and reduced over the following decades through various Supreme Court decisions and actions by local governments, with the end result that Black people could not own land or property. Even by the mid-20th century, with the New Deal, which was a time of major government investment in the American people, this investment still largely excluded Black people. A major aspect of the New Deal that built wealth for white communities was a program that helped secure mortgage loans for whites who wanted to buy homes in the newly created exclusively white communities. And this is the beginning of a practice that we still feel today called redlining, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Actually, I'd like to take a moment to call on some knowledge in the room. Folks in the chat box just want to put in, if you know what redlining is. You know, what do you know about the histories of these policies that are on the screen? I'd like to take a moment for folks to put some stuff in the chat box that they know or think they know about redlining, or even mortgage disparities and how banks lend out loans to different people depending on where they live or who they are. Alrighty, segregation by banks, absolutely. See, someone from Chicago. There is a very interesting and specific history in Chicago. I definitely encourage everyone today to read that, because that is a very classic example, I'll say. Alrighty. Thank you. Yeah, provisions in place that eliminate POC from purchasing homes. Absolutely. It's great to see that there is so much knowledge in the room, especially about the way it impacts us today. Redlining specifically was a practice where, following the guidance of the Federal Housing Administration, which was created by the New Deal, bank lenders would draw lines to physically distinguish Black and mixed race neighborhoods from exclusively white neighborhoods. Millions of dollars of investment went to exclusively white communities following this model, allowing white communities to develop at the expense of literally all others. And despite these severe racially motivated limitations, Black people were still able to create thriving communities with businesses in many major American cities. The federally backed practice of investing in white suburban communities at the expense of Black communities continued well into the 20th century, and honestly, it still continues today. Thanks to the guidance of things like the FHA, majority Black areas were deemed blight or slum, and they were picked as locations for urban development during the mid-20th century, which replaced entire communities with highways or other infrastructure projects that created the physical landscape of many cities today and erasing those past communities and the impact that they had. And in countless American cities, it's the same tale of Black displacement without compensation. And generations of Black Americans still remain in these same impoverished communities where they were forced to move to. So let's take another moment. I want to hear from y'all or invite you to write down on your own personal reflection pad. I know many of us are aware of these histories, or at the very least, we've seen how they drive inequity today. And we show up to a space like Indivisible because we care about inequity and, you know, we really want to work together to change it. So the histories of Black displacement, of redlining, financial segregation exist everywhere. I want y'all to reflect. Have you witnessed these impacts where you live? If you feel comfortable, put some in the chat box, but otherwise write it down in your own personal reflection. Haha, gentrification. Thank you. Absolutely. The perfect example I wanted to pull out. We created physically segregated societies along racial lines, and these racial lines are still continuing to drive the economic flow of whose communities are being invested in, as we see with gentrification. So thank you for putting that up there. And we found ways to reinforce that segregation through further economic disinvestment of Black people and Black communities. One of the reasons why these Black communities are prime locations in the gentrification example. This creates a system that reinforces the inferiority of a community, but does not acknowledge this effort was on purpose. And so before I go on, I want to be clear that this is just the tip of the iceberg in naming how institutional racism shows up today. And the chat box has already revealed so many ways that we're familiar with these histories in our own day-to-day lives. I also recognize that these ideas may be new to some, while others may know way more than I just shared. And we acknowledge all of you in this moment. Seriously, there is so much history worth knowing and so much more that I even have to learn myself. That's a part of what makes anti-racism a lifelong practice. That's speaking as a Black woman. So next, I want to pass it off to Nora. She's going to talk more intimately about the Indivisible movement itself and the organization's history and pitfalls in relationship to whiteness. Nora?
Thank you so much again, Raquel. Yeah, I really appreciate the introduction. I'm just always struck by how kind of a deep dive into any pocket of our history really sets me up, at least, to better understand the work that we're doing in this moment. Yeah, because the work that we need to do today to undo racism in our social space and in our structures is directly connected to everything you just spoke about. So thank you. In this next section, we're going to start with the concept of white supremacy culture, which is the systemic, institutionalized centering of whiteness. So white supremacy culture can be understood as an array of norms and standards that not only perpetuate themselves consciously and subconsciously, but can cause harm because they elevate and consolidate power around those who are most successful at following those norms. So I kind of think of them as like the mental or attitude parallel to the policies and institutions that Raquel described in the last section. So at various points in this training, we're going to refer to specific characteristics of white supremacy culture. And some of that language is going to come from a specific resource and organization called Dismantling Racism, and their work that was created in collaboration with many different anti-racist organizers over time. We'll be sending out that resource after this call. It'll be linked to the slide deck. So a list of some of the characteristics of white supremacy culture as described by the Dismantling Racism team includes perfectionism, sense of urgency, defensiveness, quantity over quality, worship of the written word, and then along with that, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, right to comfort, and many more. I know I just rattled off a whole bunch of words, and some of them might be a little bit confusing to know what they mean just at first glance without a deep dive. So I encourage all of us to hang on to that curiosity, read further into the resources we send out after this training, as well as in your own research. And even though we're not digging into each one of them individually, we just wanted to share the bulleted list to kind of introduce a few ideas for later on and prepare all of us for looking into them independently. So, and I should also note that the framework from Dismantling Racism, it's not the only framework for understanding white supremacy culture or structural or organizational racism. So we definitely encourage you to seek out other frameworks or just notice dynamics of whiteness on your own. I also want to acknowledge, I know it can feel kind of intense sometimes to hear the term white supremacy being used casually to describe habits or structures that might just feel really normal or familiar in our daily lives. So this might be one of those moments where it can be great to take a pause, feel some of that discomfort, sit with it, and just stay with us. I think if we can get comfortable using some of these concepts, or on the other hand, kind of accept the discomfort that we might feel in hearing them or applying them to ourselves and our communities, that could be a great step for helping us understand our realities so that we can change it. And to that end, we're now gonna look at how these dynamics are at play in Indivisibles history as an organization. So some little mini history lesson at Indivisible. This organization was founded by a straight white couple, Leah Greenberg and Ezra Levin. They're two people who had been in establishment politics or nonprofit work for several years before they started Indivisible. And some of you might know this story well, but Indivisible started as a written guide. It was just published in the form of a Google Doc that Ezra and Leah and some of their close colleagues and friends put out, I think about a month after Trump was elected. And the guide explained how average citizens could build power to put pressure on the members of Congress, and in the process of doing so, really push back on the Trump agenda and administration. And I'd love to take a second to ask the room, you can throw in the chat box, how did you first learn about Indivisible? How did you get involved with Indivisible? What do you remember from those first weeks or months? And I should just say too, I know there's probably some people on the call who are new to this organization. I'd be curious how you first heard about us. You can throw that in as well. Yeah, so someone said, yeah, found the guide helpful. Someone remembers that document almost being several years ago. Yeah, and it took a while to find a group while the organization was developing. Yep, downloaded the doc after you stopped crying after the election, Michelle. I hear you on that. Took a minute. Post-Women's March, okay. Yep, huge wave of interest soon after the guide came out. Yeah, so it's great to be kind of reminded of some of these stories and memories, even though I know that was a really painful moment for a lot of us. But yeah, within weeks of being released, the Google Doc went viral, it got exploded hugely, had a lot of attention, and within months, Indivisible as an organization was founded. And it's grown today to now over 6,000 registered groups and over 2,500 active groups across the United States. So if you haven't found a group yet, we can probably hook you up with one. And we've worked in coalition with a lot of other organizations on a ton of important issues, and we've seen a lot of major wins. Just to name a couple of those, we worked on impeachment. We helped bring about the impeachment victory, again, in collaboration. We helped defeat Trump Care. We were part of the Defund Hate Coalition that worked against budget allotments for ICE and CBP. We worked to support DACA, to support protecting DACA, and that just scored another major Supreme Court victory, as I'm sure a lot of folks heard. And we've also just elected or helped elect a ton of progressive leaders who won their primaries or their general elections. So, and I would imagine there's a lot of folks on the call tonight who participated in organizing around some of these successes and so many more. A lot of you probably also had local wins in groups where you live that were happening more on the ground, and if not on a national level. So all told, this story is, on one hand, it's an incredible story of regular US citizens coming together to unite against a common enemy and build sustainable power. At the same time, several pieces of the story are worth noting in getting us to an understanding of the inadvertent ways that Indivisible has centered whiteness and been influenced by white supremacy culture. So we're going to talk about a couple of those next. One element here is segregated social and personal networks. So as we mentioned, the Indivisible Guide was written by white people. It went viral via social networks. And as Raquel discussed earlier, the same institutional racism in the US that shaped social space through housing and property ownership restrictions then contributes to social networks that often themselves are segregated by race. So in short, along with many other folks, a lot of white people did read and get excited about the Indivisible Guide, which then means that white culture has been in some ways central since the beginning, even as much as all of that enthusiasm and engagement has had a really positive influence on our political system ever since. And as our organizing has continued, some of this social segregation still plays out in terms of just who we're most likely to reach out to get involved, whether that's to canvass or show up to an action or more. So another element that is at play, at least for some folks, not all, is the privilege of having been comfortable before Trump was elected. So many Indivisibles, I will acknowledge, have been active in organizing in our communities for many, many years or for much of our lives. So I definitely want to acknowledge that. And then at the same time, a lot of us who got involved with Indivisible were so fired up and ready to go and get to work, in part because Trump's election was our wake-up moment. It's a really important wake-up moment, but it might have been the first moment that we really had to face and reckon with virulent conservative forces in our government. Whereas in the meantime, a lot of organizations led by people of color and communities of color in general had already had a lot on the line before Trump was elected. And so his election maybe didn't come as a surprise or a shock, but just an intense culmination of dynamics that had been evident in daily life and in activism for people of color for many years. So once again, I just really want to emphasize every single person who has shown up in this movement is important, and each action we've taken together is really valuable. So we're naming this history just to acknowledge how, as an organization, we sometimes show up in movement spaces so that we can really bring our best selves to all of our future action. And then last but not least, the concept of worship of the written word. It's one of the characteristics of white supremacy culture from that framework I talked about earlier from the Dismantling Racism folks. So just the simple fact that the Indivisible Guide started as a Google Doc, it was shared online and through social media, all of that meant that it was most accessible to people who are comfortable with long written explanations of information and directions, and let alone those with access to the internet, familiarity with tools like Google Docs. Just to say, I know we all get confused by Google Docs and Google Drive sometimes. So yeah, and that's not to say that communities of color are not comfortable using long written formats or online tools for their organizing, but rather that activist organizations and groups that come out of pre-existing cultural communities or that favor physical space or word of mouth communication, they may already have had networks in place that they could rely on to respond to the moment of Trump's election, and thus weren't necessarily drawn to Indivisible like other folks may have been. All right, so that was a lot. I kind of already said this, but I just want to say one more time that, Indivisible as a whole and white Indivisible specifically are doing awesome work. I don't think anyone would be at this training today if we didn't have really incredible faith in and gratitude for what we've done and what we're still capable of. So we're covering all this because, we can't understand the change we need to make if we don't understand where we're coming from. And I think the sooner that we can face and even kind of welcome the reality that we're inside of, the sooner we can move towards shaping that reality in a direction that reflects our values of inclusion, inclusive democracy that we all hold. All right, so I'm going to hand it back to Raquel. She's going to introduce some of the action steps that Indivisible is already taking in this moment.
Thank you, Nora. And thank you all for, really hanging in there. This is a lot of tough stuff, and I've seen a lot of people grappling with it in the chat box already. So thank you for supporting each other. Thank you for accepting those community agreements and just landing with where we are. So before I continue talking about the process of building inclusive groups, we want to take some time and highlight some of the actions we've been seeing Indivisibles take across the country in response to this moment. Like Nora said, there has been a lot of really great work, and we can't minimize what we have done, even though there's still so much more that we can do. So maybe some of you on the call have taken these actions too. But right now, Indivisible has a landing page that's being updated on an ongoing basis, where you can go to find a full list of recommended actions and resources that have been developed in solidarity with activists from across the country, and namely Black-led organizations who are the leaders in this fight for justice. First, the first set of actions that folks have been taking has to do with people power, which is what we're all about. First, y'all been calling your local officials and telling them to defund your local police departments and invest those funds in resources people need, especially Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color. Two, ask your representatives to co-sponsor the Omar Presley resolution when you call into your elected officials. And third is to protest safely, and we really emphasize safely. We're still in a pandemic, friends. And the second bucket of actions has to do with another form of power in this country, which is money. Structural racism plays an immense role in economic inequality across the United States, like we just talked about a little bit earlier in the history section. But at $171,000, the net worth of a typical white family is nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family at $17,150 back in 2016. Gaps in wealth between Black and white households reveal the effects of racism and accumulated inequality and discrimination that people have been forced to live through. And so for these reasons, those of us with the means to are being asked to donate directly to Black-led organizations and impacted communities. Like we said, you've worked with Indivisible sometime or have been showing up in this movement in any way. You've likely already taken some of these steps. If so, keep taking them or keep asking your friends and families to do so. And in this next section, we're going to cover ways that you can start to build inclusive practices into your work and level up both your recruitment and your anti-racist organizing at the same time. My light just went out, so sorry if that was distracting to folks as it was to me. But I'll now hand it over to Nora.
Awesome, thank you, Raquel. Yeah, so this brings us to our core action step for this training. Earlier, we spent some time in that section kind of digging into step one of the process of building inclusive groups, which is building a culture of learning. And so now we're going to move on, not that that was the full building a culture of learning, obviously that's a long process, but just to spend some time in that place. And then now we're moving on to the next two steps as outlined in the Indivisible Recruitment Guide, which we can send you if you don't already have it, which are to understand the dominant culture of your group and how white supremacy shows up in your group practices. And then to make it everyone's responsibility to honor, acknowledge, and work towards changing group culture for the better. So if your group is heavily white at the moment, you don't want to bring new Black members or members of color on board only to have them be harmed, which has happened in the past, and only moves us further away from inclusive democracy. Rather, if we want to create truly inclusive groups, or if we create truly inclusive groups, then folks of color will want to be included and join in our work. So let's talk about how understanding white supremacy shows up in your group and making it everyone's responsibility to change group culture for the better. So our ask for Indivisible group leaders and group members who are white and also non-Black people of color is to take time within the month ahead to do internal work on your groups and the way you organize. So we're inviting you to initiate conversations within your Indivisible groups about how white supremacy culture has shown up in your organizing. So before I go forward, I want to acknowledge once again, there's probably some folks on the call tonight who are new to Indivisible, folks who work with other organizations, people who don't really have a movement home or an organizing home right now. And if that sounds like you, first of all, welcome. And second of all, good news. A lot of the steps that we're going to outline here are really worthwhile to have with conversations to have with family members or friends or colleagues or really whichever personal contexts kind of make the most sense to you. And I would imagine those conversations will turn out to be meaningful and worthwhile, even if they're also challenging. And we can also get you connected to an Indivisible group if you're looking for a movement home or an organizing home. And then additionally, I'll just acknowledge for many of you, conversations about the roles that we play as individuals in furthering white supremacy culture or furthering anti-Black racism. For a lot of you, those conversations are already happening. And if that's the case, first of all, thank you. And we ask that you continue on that path and use these conversations to continually move those around you and yourself to sustain and grow your action. We really don't want to lose the momentum that a lot of people are feeling in this particular time. Okay, so onward. You might be wondering, why is it important to have these conversations right now? Or how does internal work on ourselves or communities make a material difference in the lives of Black people? How does it help get Trump out of office? Considering the title of this training and the spirit that maybe brought you here tonight, how will having just a conversation allow our group or our organizing to be more inclusive? So if you're asking yourself any questions along those lines right now, I want to start by acknowledging that I hear you. I maybe don't literally hear you, but I'm with you if that's what's in your head right now. And I hear your investment in wanting to make change and your eagerness to pursue actions that can bring about the world that we want to live in. Maybe some of your impatience to not lose sight of those goals. So thank you for caring and for your focus. There's a lot of potential answers to the question of why it's important to do internal work. For one thing, our own actions have often caused harm, so we need to look at those actions if we want to repair past harm or avoid causing harm in the future. For another thing, the inclusive democracy that we dream of, that I think a lot of us dream of post-Trump, isn't going to be inclusive and won't really be democracy if it's run by white people. And even though it can be painful and uncomfortable, examining our own internalized racism and working to undo it as we move forward can be really meaningful and ultimately uplifting work. But beyond even all those reasons or justifications, more than anything, our ask tonight is to just try it and find out. Just see what you learn from having some of these conversations, notice what impact they have on your other action steps, and do remember that all the other actions that you can take right now aren't going away. You're just bringing a new lens that we think are going to help make them more impactful in the future. So we're going to look at a couple of case studies, but I do want to cover logistics real quick. Just how are you going to set these conversations up? We recommend big picture being open, direct, and intentional. And you're going to need to think through three things, which are who, what, and how. So who, first, just consider your group. Do you think members are going to be really open to this conversation? If so, you could facilitate a small group conversation with everybody in the group. If you don't think the whole group is ready, just start small. Pick one or two people you have a working relationship with and approach them about having a conversation. Then for the what, like we said, just be open, direct, and intentional. Whether you're reaching out to one or two people or the whole group, you can send an email, something along the lines of what's about to pop up on the screen here. I won't read it all the way out, just some sample language. The deck will be sent out after this training. So just an invitation based on trust and commitment to the work that's been happening. Okay, let's talk about the how a little bit. So before the meeting, you want to start by sending out some of the resources that we're going to send out to you all afterwards, or any other resources you think are relevant. Ask everyone to kind of read some of these resources over to jog ideas and reflection. And then once you're in the meeting, break up your conversation into 4 parts. First, always good to do a little go around check-in, give everybody a couple minutes to just report how they're doing in general, maybe how they're feeling about the topic at hand. Second, cover a little bit of history. Are there ways that your group has been responsible for white supremacy culture in the past? Are there any maybe core call-out moments or times when people you were working with claimed harm in some way that you didn't really deal with? Maybe I notice, oh, my group has overlooked ways that racism is showing up in the local communities that I'm part of, even though I'm fighting Trump's agenda nationally. That could be a good place to start to prompt your discussion. Then you're going to want to talk, third of all, about action. Is there anything you can do to make up for past harm? And more importantly, if not, what actions can you take going forward to work on structural racism, both internally and externally? And then the fourth piece, accountability. A lot of that is just about deciding how and when you're going to come back to this conversation. How do you make sure you don't just go back to normal, but this work on internal group culture becomes an ongoing part of your organizing? And because we're a little bit short on time, Raquel, I'm gonna go past this slide, but I would really encourage all of you to take a second right after we finish this training and think about how are you gonna set that conversation up? Who are you gonna invite? Do you wanna do your whole group, just a small one-on-one, one-on-two? Take that time as soon as you can to plan it out to make sure you really follow through on this. And in the remainder of the training, we're gonna go through 3 common examples of ways that white supremacy culture shows up in indivisible groups. And for each of these, we're going to identify an aspect of white supremacy culture at play. Carly and I are going to role play a brief example of the conversation you could have with group members about these kinds of moments. And in our role plays, we're going to imagine that we've already set up one of these kind of internal work conversations, and then we both kind of come to the table ready to discuss some past challenge moments for our indivisible group and analyze the dynamics at play. And I just realized when I said that, I'm not sure that we've acknowledged yet. Oh no, you've probably seen Carly working in the chat box. Carly's the 3rd training team member who's here tonight. Just didn't see Carly's face yet. Okay, so the 3 common characteristics of white supremacy culture we're gonna be talking about tonight are defensiveness, sense of urgency, and inappropriate differential treatment. And just a quick note, we're gonna use the acronym WSC as a written shorthand on future slides for white supremacy culture. If you see that, that's what it means. As always, just keep in mind, these examples and characteristics are not exhaustive, they're just a start. So let's move forward. Our first example is one that's pretty common. The general claim that, hey, this, that, or the other, whatever somebody's talking about, that wasn't racist, that isn't racist. Maybe somebody pointed out something your indivisible group did or is planning to do is problematic. Maybe a group member voiced a concern, maybe a partner organization brought it up. It's really common in white spaces for people to immediately respond with something that we can describe as defensiveness, as I mentioned earlier. So defensiveness can look like a lot of different things. Big picture, it's about deflecting criticism or coming up with excuses rather than accepting criticism and making changes in response. So sometimes a lot of energy gets spent trying to make sure that people's feelings aren't getting hurt or working around defensive members of the group. And sometimes white people in particular end up spending a lot of energy defending against charges of racism instead of examining how racism might actually be happening. So when someone brings up a concern about Indivisible's work and the first response is to insist that the concern is not valid, we can think about that as being an example of defensiveness. So in a moment, Carly and I are going to role play a conversation about defensiveness in an indivisible group. But before we do that, we'd like to take everyone to take a minute to reflect. Is there a moment you can think of in the past when you felt your own defensiveness crop up in response to feedback or criticism? You can just think about it quietly or jot it down. You don't have to use the chat box right now. Just to give one personal example, I'm remembering a moment last week when I saw a post on Facebook about how it's white people's responsibility to kind of get our people to talk to family members about racism and anti-racism. And I have a lot of family that I've never had those conversations with because I'm just not that close to them. We don't see each other very often. I don't really know their views on politics. So sometimes I've seen posts like that and I think, oh, well, that doesn't apply to me. Like, there's nothing I can do about that. I'm not close to those relatives. And then when I reflect on it a little bit more, I realize that those thoughts are maybe a little defensive. Like, it's me trying to find a way that that concept doesn't have to apply to me, rather than honestly looking for a way that it does apply to me and accepting that, you know, new information and really welcoming it in. So I'm gonna give a quick pause moment here for y'all to think about your own examples. And then Carly, let me know when you're ready to join on here and we can take a stab at this role play.
Hey y'all. Just to let everyone know, if they hear noise in the background, Nora and I are both in Chicago and there is a massive thunderstorm.
It's a metaphor for the work we have to do. All right, so we're gonna do a role play about indefensiveness in an indivisible group. And again, we're kind of imagining we both come to this conversation ready to have the conversation. I'll also just acknowledge we're almost at the end of the hour here. I think we are gonna end up going a little bit past the hour. If folks need to sign off, we always respect that decision. And if you can stay on a little bit longer, we're gonna keep it lively with the role plays. So stay with us if you can. Okay, so. Hey, Carly, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. I really appreciate it. This feels really important. I know it can be tough, but I'm glad to be here with you.
Yeah, no, thanks for reaching out. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Cool, thanks. So one thing I did before, just to plan for this is I was thinking about a couple of cases in the past where things happened in our group that retrospectively I didn't really feel that good about. One thing that comes to mind is when we were working with the Latino Victory Day of Action, and there was a protest about defunding ICE, and we had committed to kind of supporting that effort and turning out for them. And then when push came to shove, like the turnout was really low, and they were like, hey, we don't really feel supported by you all. You're a white-led organization. This feels kind of racist. Do you remember when that happened?
Yeah, but we sent out a recruitment email to our entire group list. Like, we can't control who goes to what events.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. I guess one thing I've been thinking about and trying to keep in mind with these kinds of things, we did take those actions, we did send out the email, but at the end of the day, if a POC-led organization is like, hey, that felt really problematic, that felt racist, maybe we should just assume that they're right in some way and start from there.
I mean, if someone tells me the sky is purple, I'm not going to automatically believe them. I need proof. I need more, I don't know.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I think I've just been trying more and more to kind of like take the feedback in and also maybe think about some action steps, right? Like, what are some action steps that we could take to avoid causing any kind of harm or taking problematic action as a group in the future?
I really thank you for bringing this to my attention. We tried really hard. I think I just need to pause. I need to think about this. I want to bring this back to the recruitment committee. Can we continue this conversation at a later date?
Sure. Yeah, we definitely can. Okay, let's debrief that moment a little bit. So there's a couple of things at play there. One element was just that it can be hard to know how to respond when people you're trying to talk to about these things aren't necessarily super responsive, or when maybe defensiveness is showing up in the moment. My character was really trying to just like sit with that, power through, and keep emphasizing assuming the criticism is valid. And then when I wasn't sure whether or not Carly was going to move with me on that, or Carly's character was going to move with me on that, I tried to move to what can we do to prevent that kind of harm from happening in the future, even if it's too late to repair harm caused in the past. And then at some point we took a pause. That's a totally valid norm to establish. Sometimes folks need time to process. Okay, let's move on to our second scenario. So another thing that comes up sometimes is something like, hey, we need to focus on getting Trump out of office. We don't have time for XYZ, this, that, or the other. Maybe we don't have time to support the movement for Black lives. Who knows what it could be. And again, this attitude could come in response to a variety of stimuli, maybe a call to work on anti-racist actions, maybe a request to slow down and have a conversation about internal dynamics we're doing tonight, maybe even, the premise of having these conversations in the first place. And so we can look at that as being a white supremacy characteristic known as sense of urgency. Sense of urgency is something that makes it difficult to take time to be inclusive or encourage democratic and thoughtful decision-making. Sometimes we end up not thinking about the long term or considering consequences because we're feeling so rushed by what we need to get done. A lot of time that results in sacrificing potential allies for quick or highly visible results, or sometimes sacrificing interests of communities of color in order to win victories for white people, or victories that white people decided on. So when someone proposes slowing down to make space for something that's important, we can think about that as being a harmful white supremacy characteristic of a sense of urgency. So in the interest of time, we're actually going to pause on, or we're going to skip our pause moment. We're not going to pause. But once again, read the resources we send out after this. Think about sense of urgency. One example that I sometimes remember is I was in a job once where I brought up inclusive hiring practices and how I was concerned about the people we were hiring. I brought it up with my manager. She was like, look at the data, do some research, write me a report. And I never did because there were other things with other deadlines, easier goals. So that's, sometimes it can be helpful to think about that sense of urgency doesn't always cause us to take actions that are harmful. Sometimes sense of urgency causes us to not take actions that would have been beneficial and would have furthered equity. So there's a lot of ways to think about this. Okay, let's jump back into the role play. Carla, you ready to go?
Ready.
Okay.
All
So
right. Nora, there's so much to do. I mean, we got to get the Senate, we got to keep the House, we got to get crazy out of office. I'm overwhelmed. There's so much to do. We got to get this done.
You know, I started sweating just hearing you list all that out, to be totally honest. So I definitely feel you. Yeah, that said, I just feel like this is a really exciting moment where we can merge with all the momentum around the movement for Black Lives and around Black Lives Matter. And just the more people that are engaged and involved right now, the more work we can do.
I can't send emails out to have people go to protest and protest and protest if we want them to phone bank in the fall. Like, we can't ask that much of our members. They have jobs and kids, and it's a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I know. I definitely hear on that, and especially the part about, you know, wanting to respect people's energy and time. I guess two things you just made me think of. One is, if there's like a lot of work to be done and a lot of emails to send, you know, this could be a really cool moment to receive all the energy and momentum building around these protests and try to connect it to some of the electoral work that we're doing. And especially, you know, I know you have a lot on your plate with running the recruitment committee. Like, if that's something where we can do some leadership development to bring other folks on board more actively, that sounds kind of cool. And second of all, you know, if there's a lot of actions to take, then anybody who feels good about any particular action can take it. You know, some people might want to protest. Some people might want to do phone banks. Some people feel good about text banks. I feel like it could be kind of cool to have all these different levels of engagement.
I just don't know how we're going to manage it all. I mean, I feel like I hear you on moving the energy towards action. Maybe we can create a committee to merge the two so that we have folks who are really interested in this work and finding out ways to you know, bridge the two together. I just can't do it all myself.
Yeah, I hear you on that. Why don't we take this as an opportunity to kind of expand who's working on which things and make sure that we can merge all those values together? Because I definitely want to take account for the amount of work that you and other people are already doing. And I don't want to say we can do it all as individuals, but I think as a collective, there's a lot that we can do. So.
Great, thanks.
Great. Okay, let's pause on that. So a couple of things going on there just to move into the debrief. I'm just going to wait for, yes, thank you for the reminder cue. Yeah, so one thing that I didn't use the exact words for, but that I was trying to get across is like, inclusion is how we win. Inclusive democracy can't leave people behind. And the same things that energize people to show up in these moments, we think at Indivisible are gonna energize people to vote and get out the vote, take actions to get out the vote. In general, just trust us. It's worth taking the time to receive feedback and process it. If you're worried there might not be enough time, just try it the next time you get a piece of feedback, see what happens, learn from that. And then last but not least, something that was really clear in that conversation was my character was looking for a way to meet Carly's character's express need of having enough people to accomplish all the work, or just feeling stressed about the amount of work to be done. Sometimes the reason why people aren't open to something or expressing that sense of urgency is because there's a lot on their plates and they're really stressed. And we can look at meeting that need in a way that still allows our other needs or our other values of equity and inclusion to be possible. Okay, let's keep it moving. We're going to do our third and final scenario, which connects to our third and final concept that we're just covering tonight, which is problematically treating people of color different than one treats white people. So this can look like a lot of different things. It often seesaws between either overemphasizing or, on the other hand, minimizing someone's presence. So it could be like pointedly asking a group member of color what they think about an issue that's specifically relevant to the demographic they're part of. Could be either implicitly or asking members of color to educate other people on how other folks should be behaving in this moment. underappreciating or not giving credit for work done by people of color, not listening to or minimizing contributions or concerns brought up by people of color. So once again, unfortunately, there's so much juicy content tonight. We didn't quite have time for all of it. So I am going to skip that moment of reflection. But I just want to encourage people, consider those moments. You don't necessarily need to post your history of harm on Facebook. Sometimes that can only kind of re-ingratiate harm that's been done in the past, but taking some time to think about that can set you up to preemptively avoid it in the future. So, okay, Carly, you ready for the role play? Okay.
Let's do it. Good thunder.
Thunder.
Folks in Chicago, I hope you're staying safe. Nora, can I be honest with you? Can I
Absolutely.
share something? I feel really stuck. I want to be a good ally. I want to act as a good ally. I want to do something, but I don't want to do the wrong thing. I don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to upset anyone. You know, I'm getting into Facebook fights and not meaning to, and being, you know, yelled at. I just don't know what to do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I've really felt that way before, for one thing. Sometimes it seems to me that like the best practice is to have no best practice. There's not going to be one particular way of acting or behaving. There are going to be times when it helps to speak up because we know that white silence is violence. There's going to be times when it helps to sit back and shut up and listen to the lead of people of color. And I think that we just got to trust ourselves that if we're putting in the work and learning and paying attention, then whatever moment arrives to us, we'll make the call that's the right fit for that moment. And we're probably going to make mistakes, but
yeah, I just like, there's so many resources out there. I don't know who to listen to. And I hear you on not the best practice, but I'm hearing so many mixed messages, and I don't know what to do.
Yeah, I've even seen some great graphics going around in social media recently kind of describing exactly that state. Honestly, Carly, I feel like we can rely on each other in that. Let's lean on each other when we need to in our confusion, and hold each other both in support and in accountability on that. And yeah, I just have to assume that exact place of not knowing exactly what to do might just be exactly where we are right now in this ongoing process.
I really appreciate the accountability thing. Can we continue this conversation? Can we keep talking about this?
Oh my God, I would love it, please. I really need that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Okay, great. So let's fast forward to the debrief here, just in respect of folks' time. So there's a couple of factors at play here. One thing I mentioned earlier that wasn't so highlighted in my conversation with Carly's or in our role play was that it can be really helpful once you know ways that harm has happened in the past, either in your own life or through reading about it in other ways, to preemptively consider how and when you might find yourself treating people differently in the future and ways that you might inadvertently cause harm. It can also help to slow down, be intentional about your communication, take the time to really think about the words you're using or the ways that you're responding to folks. And just one thing that always tends to go well is thank people for their work and for their presence. All right, so now that we finished the role plays, we're going to close out with just some quick, clear information about our asks for everyone here. And then I actually am not sure where we're at with the Q&A right now, but we'll decide whether or not we've got time to keep some of that on. So our core ask is for you all to host either a small group conversation or a one-on-one or one-on-two conversation with fellow Indivisible group members about how white supremacy culture has shown up in your group. Use the steps and resources we're going to provide in this training and send out afterwards. Shape them as fits your group. You know yourself and your community best. And bring along your own ideas and imagination, your own observations. We know this is a really powerful moment when a lot of people's perspectives are shifting, are crystallizing and changing in transformative ways. So definitely bring that energy that you're feeling to these conversations. And we also ask that you host them within the coming month. So if you're not comfortable yet or not able yet to have a conversation with a group, another option is to do solo reflection on how white supremacy culture has shown up in your life, in your family, your school, or educational context, other community or organizing spaces, your workplace, anywhere that's relevant for you. You could journal about it. You could talk with a friend. If you have a mental health professional in your life, you could talk with them about it. And just try to keep those action and accountability steps in mind if you do this solo. And then if you're not in a position to have these conversations at all yet, our ask just circles back to what we covered already in the training about steps that folks are already taking. Make sure you've taken all the steps. Make sure you're calling your elected officials. Make sure you're calling your members of Congress. Make donations to Black-led organizations if and when you can. And ask a friend or a family member too, if you've done all those things already. So.
Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you, Carly, for that role play. I love seeing you guys interact together, and yeah, just how honest that was. Like, these are going to be some really potentially uncomfortable conversations, but as long as you get that commitment, just like we made with our community agreements, as long as you have that commitment to just really meet each other in the same place, you can work through all those moments and you'll be better for it at the other end. So thank you for modeling that, and thank you all for staying on. It's already 10 minutes after the top of the hour, so unfortunately we will not be able to stick around for question and answer because it's already past 9 o'clock on the East Coast and I have a bedtime. But we will absolutely, in all seriousness, we will absolutely answer those questions that you dropped in the chat box, and we'll send them around with the follow-up materials, including all of the resources we mentioned, as well as the recording for this webinar and the slide deck and all of that good stuff. So thank you all for sitting with anything that was uncomfortable. Thank you for sticking with us. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And we really encourage you to go deeper under the surface and learn more. And to help you pursue your anti-racist education beyond tonight, you will see on the screen some extra resources you can explore. These are live links on the slide deck, and they will be sent around post-training so you can actually follow them. Indivisible also put together a resource guide that we can share in the chat box. And we will also have a link to that in the follow-up email as well. But these are ways you can take action for the moment we're in right now and developed in solidarity with Black-led organizations in Minneapolis. Remember that we're all in this together. Follow the lead of Black-led organizations, take action safely, and it's your responsibility to do this work within your own group. You know, white silence is violence, and that's very, very real. This is what makes this moment right now different than the others, but we have to continue this momentum to make sure it actually brings about the change we need it to actually make sure it's different than the other sort of flashpoints that we felt over these past few years. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. Please wash your hands, don't touch your face, love, support each other, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.